So like I said, it's not discussed that much, so I figured we can, I looked into a little bit and came up with this, and I guess just remember, I'll say, the views expressed here are solely my own and not necessarily those of the congregation or the other people here. So it's just stuff that I came up with. So the word unclean occurs in 169 verses in the Bible. For this discussion, we're unconcerned with the verses, dealing with clean and unclean foods. Because they're not specifically related to making us unclean. First, go ahead.
That is a question, though. If by chance it happens to come into our body by just, whatever, how do we have you say you're not going to discuss that?
Well, no, not specifically, but it does, there are some verses in here that we'll cover that says if you touch the carcass of an unclean animal, you are unclean.
Yeah.
So that would be the same thing as touching it. If we unintentionally ingest it, then we're unclean. And there's it goes over what you do to become clean after that. So first we look at how a person becomes unclean. The Torah gives us many ways we can become unclean. We can become unclean due to contact with an unclean animal. Leviticus 5:2-3. Or when a being touches any unclean matter, or the carcass of an unclean beast, or the carcass of an unclean livestock, or the carcass of unclean creeping creatures, and it has been hidden from him, he is unclean and guilty. Or when he touches the uncleanness of man, or any of his uncleanness by which he is unclean, and it has been hidden from him, when he shall know it, then he shall be guilty. Leviticus 11:24. And by these you are made unclean, anyone touching the carcass of any of them that is unclean until evening. We can also become unclean as a result of naturally occurring bodily functions. Leviticus 12:2. Speak to the children of Israel, saying, when a woman has conceived and has given birth to a male child, then she shall be unclean 7 days, as in the days of her monthly separation she is unclean. And Leviticus 15:19. And when a woman has a discharge, and the discharge from her flesh is blood, she has to be in her separation for 7 days, and whoever touches her is unclean until evening. Leviticus 13:3. And the priest shall look at the infection on the skin of the body, and if the hair on the infection has turned white, and the infection appears to be deeper than the skin of his body, it is a leprous infection. And the priest shall look at him and pronounce him unclean. Leviticus 15:2. Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when any man has a discharge from his flesh, his discharge is unclean. We can become unclean by touching an unclean person or by touching something that an unclean person has touched. Leviticus 15:4. And any bed becomes unclean on which he who has the discharge lies, and any object on which he sits becomes unclean. And Leviticus 15:7. And he who touches the flesh of him who has the discharge has to wash his garments and shall bathe in water and shall be unclean until evening. And 15:9. Any saddle on which who has the discharge rides becomes unclean. And 15:20. And whatever she lies on during her separation is unclean, and whatever she sits on is unclean. Since we know there are many ways that we can become unclean, the focus now goes to what do we do to become clean. There are different instructions provided on how one becomes clean depending upon how they become unclean. They include doing nothing and you will become clean at evening, bathing in water and becoming clean at evening, washing your garments, bathing and becoming clean at evening. So it depends on what happened to make you unclean as to what you have to do to become clean. The most restrictive is being sprinkled with the water which was mixed with the ashes of the red heifer. In Numbers 19:13-17, anyone who touches the dead of a human being and does not cleanse himself defiles the dwelling place of Yahweh, and that being shall be cut off from Israel. He is unclean, for the waters of uncleanliness was not sprinkled upon him. His uncleanness is still upon him. This is the Torah when a man dies in a tent. All who come into the tent and all who are in the tent are unclean for 7 days, and every open vessel which has no cover fastened on it is unclean. Anyone in the open field who touches someone slain by a sword or who has died, or a bone of a man, or a grave, is unclean for 7 days. And for the unclean being they shall take some of the ashes of the heifer burnt for cleansing from sin. And
Where were you at now?
Numbers 19. And running water shall be put on them in a vessel. In Numbers 19:19, and the clean one shall sprinkle the unclean on the 3rd day and on the 7th day. And on the 7th day he shall cleanse himself, and shall wash his garments, and bathe in water, and shall be clean in the evening. But the man who is unclean and does not cleanse himself, that being shall be cut off from among the assembly, because he has defiled the set-apart place of Yahweh. Water for uncleanness has not been sprinkled upon him. He is unclean, and it shall be a law for them forever. And the one who sprinkles the water for uncleanness washes his garments, and the one who touches the water for the uncleanness is unclean until evening. And whatever the unclean being touches is unclean, and the being who touches it is unclean until evening. I couldn't find any permanent negative ramifications for being unclean. Being unclean could affect what you could do and where you could go while you were unclean. Depending on the action or locations, the ramifications could be mild or severe. I couldn't specifically find a verse saying that you could not partake the Passover if you were unclean. Numbers 9:6-11 recount the story of men who were concerned about not being able to keep Passover because they were unclean. These specific men were unclean due to contact with a dead person. Scripture says that they were instructed to keep Passover in the 2nd month. Numbers 9:10. Speak to the children of Israel, saying, when any male of you or of your generations is unclean for a being, or is far away on a journey, he shall still perform the Passover of Yahweh. This does leave the question about men being unclean for other reasons. While if someone was unclean due to contact with a dead body in the first month, it is likely that they could avoid contact with a dead body the following month to be able to keep the Passover. It does bring up the question of a woman who is unclean due to her monthly cycle. If she were unclean in the first month and has a standard 28-day cycle, she is likely to be unclean the 2nd month as well. Does that mean that women would not be able to keep the Passover that year? Or was it only men that were not to keep the Passover if unclean, or something else? And I looked and I couldn't find anything. So, it's just one of the things that, we have to, discuss.
Did women do were women included in that?
And that's the thing, is that the Scriptures clearly says it was the men who were required 3 times a year to go up. So, does that, I guess it really all depends on what we're concerned with. What does it really mean to us today? And I guess there's I couldn't find any real clear Scriptures regarding it. So, yeah. Exactly. After having a child, a woman was unclean for either 33 or 66 days, depending on if she had a boy or girl child. And Leviticus 12:2-4. Speak to the children of Israel, saying, when a woman has conceived and has given birth to a male child, then she shall be unclean 7 days, as in the manner of her monthly separation she is unclean. And on the 8th day the flesh of his foreskin is circumcised, and she remains in the blood of her cleansing 33 days. She does not touch whatever is set apart, and she does not come into the set-apart place until the days of her cleansing are completed. And there again, that's talking about, what's it actually mean to, what did it mean to them? What were the ramifications of being unclean?
That's interesting there, because it does talk about her going into the set-apart place.
So that's what it meant back then, was if she was unclean, there wasn't anything. It wasn't a sin. There wasn't anything wrong with her. She just couldn't go into the set-apart place because as to not defile the temple. That's what it was all about.
But that means that they did go into the temple.
Yes.
Otherwise, there would have been
no reason to mention it.
Right.
Exactly. So, as it was most likely the men who would take the lamb up to the temple to be sacrificed, it would be possible for the family to keep Passover, but special care would need to be taken because, as we have seen, to touch someone who was unclean would render you unclean. So if your wife or daughter was unclean and you would be headed to the temple, you had to take special care to remain clean yourself because there could be some serious ramifications. When outlining the regulations related to the guilt offerings in Leviticus 7, we are told the following. Leviticus 7:19-21. And the flesh that touches that which is unclean is not eaten, it is burned with fire. As for the clean flesh, all who are clean eat of it. But the being who eats the flesh of the peace offering that belongs to Yahweh while he is unclean, that being shall be cut off from his people. And when a being who touches that which is unclean of the uncleanness of man or the uncleanness of beast or any unclean swarming creature and shall eat the flesh of the peace offering that belongs to Yahweh, that being shall be cut off from his people. Numbers 19:13. Anyone who touches the dead of a human being and does not cleanse himself defiles the dwelling place of Yahweh, and that being shall be cut off from Israel. In Numbers 19:20, but the man who is unclean and does not cleanse himself, that being shall be cut off from among the assembly, because he has defiled the set-apart place of Yahweh. Water for uncleanness has not been sprinkled on him. He is unclean. Once again, it's talking about, there's not ramifications specifically for being unclean. It's based on what you do when you're unclean. Don't go to the temple and defile the temple. Again, the same thing is said about all the set-apart offerings. In Leviticus 22:4-6, any man of the offspring of Aaron who is a leper or has a discharge does not eat the set-apart offerings until he is clean. And whoever touches what is rendered unclean by a corpse, or a man who has had an emission of semen, or a man who touches any creeping creature by which he would be made unclean, or any being whom he would become unclean, even any of his uncleanness, the being who has touched it shall be unclean until evening, and does not eat the set-apart offerings, but shall bathe his body in water. Another reason it was important to know when you are unclean is that Yahweh cannot be in the presence of any unclean thing. Numbers 5:2-3. Command the children of Israel to send out of the camp every leper and everyone who has a discharge, and whoever becomes defiled for a being. Send out both male and female, send them outside the camp, so that they do not defile their camps in the midst of which I dwell. In Deuteronomy 23:14, for Yahweh your Elohim walks in the midst of your camp to deliver you and give your enemies over to you. Therefore your camp shall be set apart, so that he does not see unclean matter among you and shall turn away from you. All these scriptures have shown us that because they were the ones who would normally be entering the set-apart place and were therefore the ones who had the most potential to defile the set-apart place, it was mainly the priests who had to be concerned with being unclean. But since the priest had daily interaction with the entire people, it was important for the entire people to understand how to determine if they were clean or unclean, so as not to put the priests at risk of being cut off. If they were unclean, they were to let others know so that they would not risk making them unclean.
Actually, didn't they have to go through and chant?
Leviticus 13:45. As for the leper who has an infection, his garments are torn, his head is uncovered, and he has to cover his upper lip, saying, unclean, unclean. So what does this mean for us today? The majority of us are unclean because I do not think there are any ashes from the sacrificed red heifer to use for cleansing oneself, and almost all of us have been to a funeral or touched someone who has gone to a funeral, and according to Numbers 19, which we previously covered, are unclean. Since the major prohibitions against someone who were unclean was the inability to go to the temple, and there is not currently a temple, a high priest, or a currently standing Levitical priesthood, in my opinion, as it relates to our day-to-day lives, it makes no difference today if you are clean or unclean. It's not a sin to be unclean. Yeshua himself was made unclean when he was touched by the woman who had the flow of blood for 12 years.
Hallelujah.
This does not mean that we can eat things that he has identified as unclean. That is a totally different subject for another day. We are called to be a set-apart people. Deuteronomy 14:2. If you are set-apart people to Yahweh your Elohim, and Yahweh has chosen you to be a people for himself, a treasured possession above all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. In 2 Corinthians 6:17, therefore come out from among them and be separate, says Yahweh, and do not touch what is unclean, and I shall receive you. When people look at us and how we live, they should be able to tell that we are different. When people seeing us eating clean, keeping Sabbath, and keeping the feast, they see that there is something different about us, and that will set us apart. Yahweh bless.
And we go on to the fact that